So, hi, David, how are you?
I'm okay, thank you very much. How are you?
I'm fine too. So I'm with my friend, the writer David Pryce-Jones. I've known David and also his wonderful wife, Clarissa, just about all my life because they're close family friends, though they're also friends to me in their own right too. And David has certainly not only very interesting himself, he's met an amazing array of interesting people. He's met everyone from Somerset Maugham to Stalin's daughter Svetlana, who I think even stayed in that house where you are in Wales right now, where we're doing the interview for a couple of weeks. And we met Arthur Koestler, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and so on. And David, of course, has written many, many books over the last 60 years, both novels and non-fiction. And David is an extremely youthful 84, but bursting with new ideas and vitality. And indeed, I've just been reading the reviews of David's latest book that just came out this month. Some great reviews in the Washington Post and elsewhere. So let me just ask you very quickly, first of all, David, we're in the coronavirus lockdown period for the last couple of months. You're doing okay?
Yes, we're in a little house we have in Wales and we're doing extremely well.
Good, glad to hear it. So, David, let's go back to the beginning. Tell me, where were you born? Where were you in your early childhood?
I was born in Vienna. In my family, my mother was Viennese, half French, half Austrian, and altogether Jewish. And they had a house called Meidling, and I was born in the same room that my mother had been born in, but it was 1936. And we stayed there till 1938 when it was time to go.
And then, was it, you went to France, I believe, then?
Yes, because my French grandfather had a house called Royaumont, which is near Chantilly, not so far from Paris. And my father was called up into the intelligence service. He'd done some very blank things we don't know about in his intelligence work. When I asked him, he would say, "I don't remember." But,
of course, your mother was French and Austrian, but your father was British and he was working for British intelligence.
That's right. That's right. We could leave because my father, thank God, was British.
Yeah.
And but the Gestapo took everything, of course, of my family. And I was in France while my father went off to do his intelligence work at Bletchley, and the Germans took everybody by surprise.
But I also, of course, know that in essence, though maybe this phrase was not used for a long time, you're in essence a child Holocaust survivor in the sense that you were, caught in the war, weren't you, when war broke out when you were 3 or 4 years old, and you were with your nanny in France and the Germans invaded. And of course, because your mother was Jewish, you would have been a victim too, and you had to hide and escape. Isn't that right?
That is absolutely right. And I had my mother's elder sister had married a Spanish diplomat, and he got us out eventually into Spain and then to Morocco. And in 1941, I was in Morocco, in Tangier. And I told my story once to Saul Bellow, and Saul Bellow looked at me and he said, "Yes, you had the Jewish experience."
Yes, that is true. And of course, I do remember, if we just fast forward briefly, a few years ago, we met in Tel Aviv because you were on the way to Jerusalem to make sure that the man who did indeed help save your life was honored by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust memorial in Jerusalem, as a righteous gentile. And you're with your cousins, the Mostyn Owens and the Bonham Carters. And that was very important, I think, that you did honor that man, wasn't it?
Yes, they made my uncle Eduardo an honorary
righteous savior.
Yes, yeah. There were 4 Spanish people in, I think 20,000 Poles and 4 Spaniards, of which Eduardo was one.
You mean 4 Spaniards who did not by Yad Vashem? Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, then you went to England and you became fully English in a way, or up to a point. So tell me about your experiences arriving in England and so on, and your childhood there?
Well, when I arrived in England, I couldn't speak proper English, and I spoke with a French accent. There were people who said, David always says, "Look at the cows, they are so pretty." And my parents thought that it was very unwise to send me to a boys' school because the boys would tease me. So my parents' house in London had been destroyed by a firebomb in one of the raids. And we had gone to live in Kent on the estate of Harry Davidor Goldsmith, who was a great and wonderful man, a kind of honorary father to me. And my parents sent me to Kent College for Girls. I was one of two boys at Kent College for Girls.
Ahead of your time, David, mixing, all the better for the mix. But I think later on, if I remember you telling me, you did then go to that most English of sort of secondary schools, public schools, Eton, and of course
Yes.
after Oxford. So how was that?
Well, I didn't know any. I was an only child, and I was very much an only child, and I didn't know any. I had no friends. I was very bookish. I was tremendously well read when I was 17, and much better read then than I am now. But I suddenly discovered other people, and when I was about my last year at Eton, I became extremely social, and I haven't stopped since.
That's good. That's good. And of course, when did you became a writer after Oxford? I think you studied history at Oxford and then became a writer. Were there any other options? I mean, your father was a literary person, and yes, you said you're very bookish. Were you kind of destined to be a writer?
Yes, if my father had been a plumber, I'm sure I'd have been a plumber too. I was, I'm afraid, a goody-goody. I never rebelled. And I always knew I was going to write. That's what everybody did around. The house was full of proofs and people talking about books, and that was what you did. And I wrote a piece in some Oxford undergraduate magazine, and I got a letter from Longmans, a man called John Guest, and he said, "I can see you're going to be a writer. When you finish a book, send it to us."
Mm-hmm.
I finished a book after I left Oxford, sent it to John, and got a letter back saying, "We're publishing in February. Thank you very much." I think that's 1 in 1,000. That it doesn't happen like that.
No, and you haven't looked back. That was like 60 years ago or something. And of course, if you met a lot of important writers, but if I could just go to one, maybe not the most important in general, but the most important to me, which is my father, John Gross, who you are a great friend with. And of course, I just want to mention also, of course, because he was I hope, distinguished writer, also my mother is a literary figure. I also grew up surrounded by writers and so on as a child. So what are your recollections of my father, John?
John was a wonderful conversationalist. Speech was really his medium, although his book about men of letters is a wonderful book. He saw the human comedy in full. He really enjoyed very much other people and telling stories about them that gave away their character and who they were and what they'd done and why they'd done it and what we were to think about it. There was always a very strong undertow of moral thinking in John. He passed judgment on people. I think if he'd actually done it more publicly, he'd have been an international figure, because he really knew the world that he was talking about.
Well, witty, yes, I really agree. I mean, it's a pity that he was a little bit shy in a way about going before camera, or rather, unfortunately, he passed away in 2011 before there were things like Zoom that we're speaking now that makes it kind of easier to record conversations. But in my memories, as in yours, the most amazing conversations and nuggets of information and as a high literary gossip and amusing stories and anecdotes. I mean, his books are wonderful, but as you say, his conversation was amazing. I'm not just saying that because he was my father.
He did 5 years as the literary critic on the New York Times. And I must say his version of the inner life of the New York Times was hilarious. Full of libel. I'm afraid I'd better not repeat it.
You can repeat it because, you know, my father's not, I've heard these stories too, but you go ahead.
Well, there was the various Salzburgers, wasn't there? Punch Salzburger was a man that he was absolutely brilliant at mocking.
Who was the owner? They were the owners at the time of the New York Times.
Yes, that's right.
All the partial owners.
I think John thought the New York Times was wrong about pretty well everything.
Well, I agree with him, I'm afraid to say. I think it's a very, you know, when he lived in New York, and of course spent time there, he was working for the New York Times, and this was the days before the internet, he had to buy the London Times at some price, got flown in every day, because he said, not because I want to know what's happening in Britain, I want to know what's happening in America, the rest of the world. So he read the London Times rather than the New York Times, and, you know, my friends in New York put the New York Times, it's like the Quran for them, it can do no wrong. But, you know, I mean, obviously it does have good writers and some good pieces, but in some respects, it's very overrated. Let me just go to some of the other writers you've spent time with. I know that you, for example, who else? Let's say Arthur Koestler. I read Darkness at Noon as a teenager, so that's somebody who must have been interesting. No, you knew him quite well, I think.
I knew Arthur extremely well. We lived pretty close to him, and he used to invite me to come and have a drink on Sunday before lunch. And there were all his friends, Mel Lasky and Ed Shields and Ian Hamilton, who wrote the first book about him, and so on. And it was in Arthur's drawing room that Goronwy Rees said that Anthony Blunt had tried to recruit him to the KGB. And I said to the man standing next to me, who was John Mander, have you heard what I've just heard? And he said, oh, didn't you know? That's Goronwy's party piece. Well, if you could find out in Arthur Koestler's house in 1962 that Anthony Blunt had been a KGB man, did you have to wait till 1978 when Mrs. Thatcher told Parliament that he was?
And of course, for younger people who might not remember, Blunt was an esteemed British citizen. Who was a Soviet spy, masked later as a Soviet KGB spy. He was for the Queen's Art. Was he the Queen's Art? I can't remember now. Have I got that right?
That he was what?
No. Remind us who Blunt was.
Oh, he was the Queen. Yes, he was the Queen's. I'm not sure the exact title, but he was in charge of the curator of the collections.
I mean, the point is, he was a Soviet agent who had, I don't know, daily, but regular access to the sovereign, to the Queen. So really shocking. Anyway, what about Isaac Bashevis Singer? I've always, you know, he's one of my favorite writers, you know, the first Yiddish writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. You met him.
He was a wonderful writer.
Yeah.
The Magician from Lublin is a great masterpiece. Well, I began by going to interview him, and he was extremely friendly to me and very nice. I gave him the book that I'd written about the Palestinians, and we got off on Zionist questions, really. He was a Zionist. In his apartment in New York, there were heaps of mailbags full of letters from fans, which he never answered, and it showed you how popular he really was. He lived on the Upper West Side, and it was a kind of amazing, gloomy building. And the minute you entered it, it was exactly like going back to Warsaw 1930. All the people there were Polish Jews. And there are these wonderful names. I used to spend quite a lot of time just reading the names on the door plate. Isaac was a terrific talker. He used to leap up from his chair and spring about and say things with immense passion. I really enjoyed his company very much. He was terribly nice to me. Perhaps I shouldn't say this, I got some very flattering letters from him.
That's nice. Well, fantastic. Tell me, also, Stalin's daughter, I also met her because my mother interviewed her for the Observer newspaper, and she came to our house. So Svetlana, Stalin's daughter, I met her a couple of times. But as I said at the beginning, she stayed with you in the house you're in now during the coronavirus lockdown. You're in Wales, your country house in Wales, and Svetlana Stalin stayed with you for a couple of weeks. How was she as a house guest?
Well, she said at the beginning that she was never going to speak about her father. But in fact, she spoke about nothing else. And she would come down to meals and talk about her time in the Kremlin. And I would rush away afterwards and write it all down. I kept a diary of all that period. She was a very difficult customer. She had actually said she would never come to Wales, and then she wrote and said she'd like to come.
Yeah.
I can remember her doing some very touching things, though. She wanted to cook, and she made a kind of special chicken dish with Clarissa. Spent all day with the ingredients and all the rest of it, and that was really rather touching. If somebody had told me that Stalin's daughter was going to prepare chicken for me, I'd have not believed it.
Of course, you know, she was a troubled person. She defected to America, then moved to Britain, and then famously or infamously decided to go back to the Soviet Union in the last few years. And obviously, she denounced her father as a monster and so on. And you know, her father had driven Stalin had driven her mother to suicide. But anyway, who else? I know. What about? I remember you had covered, I was right, the famous chess match between Fischer and Spassky in Iceland in Reykjavik, was it? Is that right? Have you covered that?
Yes, I did. I did that with Arthur Koestler, as a matter of fact. He was doing it for the Sunday Times, and I was doing it for the Sunday Telegraph. And as we set off in the early morning, the plane took off about 8:30 in the morning for Reykjavik, and the air hostess came on and said, would Mr. Arthur Koestler make himself known? And Arthur raised a hand, and she said, we'd like to give you a drink courtesy of Lufthansa, or whatever the airline is called. And Arthur said, yes, I'll have some brandwein. And she said, we call it brennivin in Iceland. In Iceland, they're fond of telling you correction things.
Okay.
And Arthur was given this alcohol out of a brown parcel, you know, it was obviously home brew. He swigged the thing straight off and held his hand out for another one. Swigged that straight off, and then said, my friend will have one. So I was given a glass. I said, look, it's 8:40 and I can't possibly get it down. So Arthur took the third one. And then after a moment, he said, but this is murder, and fell back on the seat and didn't speak again till we reached Iceland. And it was the beginning of, again, a very comic week with Iceland, with Arthur. He was good at chess, and he produced a sentence which I find very memorable about Fischer's play. He said, you must understand the Hungarian accent too. Fischer has understood better than anybody else the midfield aura of the Queen. Whatever that is.
Wonderful. So I know that you're also a very keen supporter of Israel, and you were friends with, you know, people like George Weidenfeld and Bernard Lewis and Eli Kaduri. You're interested in, you're an expert on the Middle East among much else too, and also on the Arab world. Tell me about your interest with Israel.
Well, the various relations of my grandmother were deported and murdered.
In the Holocaust, you mean? In the Holocaust?
From France. The Alatinis were taken to Drancy and then finished in Auschwitz. And it was part of my upbringing to know these things. And a lot of my mother's friends had been persecuted, and some of them also murdered. So I wanted to know what this meant to me. Mm. And I went to Israel in order to find that out. And I said to Longmans that I'd like to do that. And Longman said, you can have £100 advance. And I got a letter the next day saying, when we said £100, we remember that we have a big Arab market, £50. So I told this to George Weidenfeld, who commissioned it properly and gave me a decent advance. And I went off to Israel for a year, to live in Israel in 1962. And
How long did you live there for?
a year, researching the book.
Obviously,
The book is called Next Generation. It came out in 1965. And when NASA moved into the Sinai in 1967, I said to the Telegraph, this must mean a war. So there was another very nice editor called John Anstey, who said, oh, if you know so much about it, out you go. So I arrived in time for the 67 war. And having done that, I did the 73 war, and then I wrote a book about the Palestinians. And I've been deeply engaged. I am a Zionist. I think that the Jews have a right to a nation state, and they have a right to it where it is.
And a secure one as well.
Yes, that's right. And I become very involved, really, with why the Palestinians won't accept any political activity. They just rely on terror. And it's, in the end, it's going to destroy them.
And you know, I don't think it's just the Palestinians. I think their so-called friends in Europe are often encouraging them not to compromise, and they're helping condemn them to another generation without a state. I mean, President Trump, as we know, and Netanyahu have offered the Palestinians a state right now, the Trump peace plan. It may not be perfect for the Palestinians, but to refuse to even negotiate when, you know, there are about 130 stateless peoples in the world who would like a state, and the Republican president and the right-wing, the Likud Prime Minister of Israel are offering them a state with $50 billion. And I think that it's not only the Palestinians, they're almost encouraged by European diplomats not to negotiate, or at least not to negotiate seriously. And it's almost as if European diplomats and academics and others are enjoying the prolongation of the conflict, which could finish if they told the Palestinian Authority that we're not going to fund you anymore. We're going to, you know, listen, go into negotiations, accept the Trump plan as a starting point, and then negotiate adjustments accordingly. But I don't know, you've written a book on especially the French foreign ministries dealing with the Arab world. I mean, what do you feel about that?
Well, I think the French did enormous harm in the Middle East. That's a historic business. It goes right the way back, from Napoleon onwards. And the Quai d'Orsay is institutionally hostile to the idea of Israel and Zionism in general. Some of the French consuls really have been proper anti-Semites. And it's a very depressing thing. My particular bugbear, as a matter of fact, is people who incite the Palestinians to resist, and because they're actually condemning a lot of perfectly nice, innocent young men to die. If the alternative is kill or be killed, you kill, if that's the alternative, and that's what it's coming down to. And in the end, the Palestinians will be left with nothing.
I fear that, and also, by the way, I'm going to be interviewing as part of this series one or more of my Palestinian friends, and they actually share these feelings. I mean, you know, the so-called friends of the Palestinians in the West, including some left-wing Jews, are not their friends at all. They're just encouraging a prolongation of the conflict. I mean, obviously there's some faults on the Israeli side too, but you know, sometimes I worry that it's not kind of latent anti-Semitism among some Europeans who almost enjoy this conflict continuing. And they don't really want to solve it, they want to prolong it. Do you feel that way, or?
Well, I'm afraid they do. It comes down to an emotional attitude in the end, because it's not political. It's what is happening is a very great tragedy. The Palestinian state that would be erected if they had a state would be not worth having. It would be another small, squalid tyranny. I see just now that Palestinian journalists are being arrested. by their own authorities.
Yeah.
And that's what would happen. It would be another little Iraq or little Syria, and it would have no human rights of any kind at all, and it would be unlivable from the Israeli point of view. This is, again, part of the tragedy, that if you talk to Palestinians in the refugee camps and all this, after a bit, they tell you the truth, which is that they've had enough of this, and they would gladly sign a peace treaty, but nobody's allowing them to do so.
Yes. You know, we mentioned the New York Times earlier, and I think, and I've written about it, that they consistently get the Israeli-Palestinian conflict 100% wrong, not just a bit wrong, it's topsy-turvy the way they cover it. They also, of course, covered for a long time the Soviet Union and got it very wrong. And I know that you were friends with the great Robert Conquest, you know, who was critical of Stalin and the famine and everything. And, you know, the New York Times correspondent famously was almost a fellow traveler of the Soviet regime. Not that the New York Times has done that much introspection about that after the end of communism. Tell me, I mean, I've met Bob Conquest too with my father, but tell me of your dealings with him before he passed away.
Bob was a great man. I was the literary editor of The Spectator, and he was the foreign news editor of The Spectator back in the 60s. And Bob was absolutely forthright in what he didn't suffer fools at all. There was a lunch club with Kingsley Amis and Bob and one or two other people who used to, and it was tremendous fun. And I became very fond of Bob. He hated Eric Hobsbawm and kind of communist people who we had among us. Bob went off to California. He was also a very good poet, and he wrote some wonderfully comic, scurrilous verse about people.
Some of them are too naughty to
which I better not quote again.
No, some of them are pretty naughty stuff.
I'm afraid anyway, 4-letter words come into it.
David, I've read some of them. So, David, just to finish off, is there anything more about your family? We maybe didn't quite speak about your mother's extraordinary family, also your father's. Have you got any parting thoughts about them?
Well, I think my grandmother, my mother's mother, was a very extraordinary lady. She was the child of Gustav Springer in Vienna, and she was the Springer orphanage was for Jewish boys, and it was called the Springer Waisenhaus. And she spent the war. She got away. She spent the war in Canada. And after the war, where should she go? She went and bought a house in Florence, in Italy. And I have a great love for the Italians. It's everybody's second country. It's the country they'd most like to live in after their own, I think. The Italians are very good, great people. The law in Italy is indicative, but not obligatory.
That's right.
And that makes them very human people. Well, my grandmother lived the rest of her life in Florence, and when she died, her children, my mother had died also, so I stood in for her. We inherited the house, and we had a family house, which I'm glad to say is still a family house, and it's given us enormous pleasure and, if I may say so, culture.
You may. So, David, that's a fascinating interview, a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. Hopefully the corona situation will improve very quickly, and much as it's lovely there in Wales, you'll be able to travel once again to Florence, among other places. So, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Bye. Thank you.